so I'd like to go ahead and get started. I know we have three papers lined up that are excellent. I want to give as much time as we can to our three presenters. So it's my pleasure to welcome all of you to this afternoon session of the conference, where we have three papers given from three different traditions, one Catholic, one Orthodox, and one Jewish. And so each presenter will have 20 minutes to make a presentation, and then we'll save questions until the end, until all three presentations have taken place. So as the presentations commence, I invite you to write questions in the chat feature. I'll be monitoring it. And at the end of the three papers, you're also welcome to raise your hand and I'll recognize you and invite you to ask your question. In the interest of time, I'll keep my introductions brief and I'll introduce each speaker before he begins his paper. So let me begin by welcoming Dr. Matthew Tapie to the conference. Dr. Tapie is the Associate Professor of Theology and Director of the Center for Catholic and Jewish Studies at St. Leo University in St. Leo, Florida. Dr. Tapie is the author of Aquinas on Israel and the Church, a study of the question of supersessionism and the theology of Thomas Aquinas, which was the focus of a special session at the 51st International Congress on Medieval Studies in 2016. He's a co-editor also of Reading Scripture as a Political Act from 2015 and The Business of War, Theological and Ethical Reflections on the Military-Industrial Complex from 2020. Dr. Tapie is also series editor of the Judaism and Catholic Theology series within the Catholic University of America Press. And he serves on the advisory board of the journal Studies in Christian-Jewish Relations. From 2016 to 2021, Dr. Tapie served on the leadership team of the CTSA's Consultation on Judaism and Christianity, and he's also a member of the USCCB's Dialogue with Modern Orthodox Judaism. Finally, in 2016, Dr. Tapie was appointed to the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum's Committee on Ethics, Religion, and the Holocaust. Today, his paper is entitled, I Have Called You Friends, the Catholic Church's Affirmation of Rabbinic Judaism as a Resource for Christian Theology. Welcome, Dr. Tapie.
Thank you very much, Andrew, for that very generous introduction. I'm very honored to be here, and especially I want to thank Jesper for your invitation to be with everybody today. And although I am happy to be online with you, I really do long for the in-person experience of all the small talk that happens at the conference. I know I'd be able to get to know more people. So thank you for your time. My paper is called I've Called You Friends, the Catholic Church's Affirmation of Rabbinic Judaism as Resource for Christian Theology. The claim that God's covenant with the Jewish people is irrevocable is now commonplace among Christians. The claim, which is now a statement of Catholic faith, however, has not been fully processed by Catholics. One question theologians have wrestled with is how Catholics should understand God's irrevocable covenant with the Jewish people in relation to their faith. For instance, how does this claim relate to the Christian confession and the universal salvific significance of Jesus Christ? As others have observed, this is one of the most difficult and sensitive questions facing Christian theology today. I want to argue that from a Catholic perspective, reflection on this difficult question must prioritize St. Paul's address to the Gentile Christians in Romans 11:25. In this verse, we learn that Christian reflection on the election of Israel faces a particular temptation. Paul thought Gentile Christ followers might become, quote, wise in their own estimation. To avoid conceited theologies of Israel, Paul stresses that Gentile Christ believers of his time should be aware of a mystery. As we shall see, the decision of the drafters of Nostra Aetate to leave out any reference to conversion was based on a particular interpretation of this mystery. And the decision to leave out the reference to conversion was actually a theological decision, and recognition of this mystery has helped cultivate a positive Catholic attitude toward toward Judaism. How did the drafters of Nostra Aetate interpret Romans 11:25, and how has this interpretation shaped Catholic attitudes to Jews and Judaism today will be the focus of my talk. And so in what follows, I first highlight how Catholic teaching has affirmed the Jewish people as well as their religious life. And in the last part of my talk, I describe how the biblical roots of this positive attitude might serve as a resource for our discussions of the Christian tradition in general as we go along throughout the conference. Before I jump into how the drafters of Nostra Aetate interpreted Romans 11:25, I want to first turn briefly to contemporary reactions to a 2015 document called Gifts and the Calling of God from the Vatican. In 2015, this document was issued. And the authors explain in this document that the universal and exclusive mediation of salvation through Jesus Christ belongs to the core of Christian faith. The Vatican, though, then says immediately after this, in paragraph 36, however, although there is one path to salvation according to the church, this does not mean that the salvation of the Jewish people is undermined. It does not follow in any way that Jews are excluded from God's salvation because they do not believe in Jesus Christ as the Messiah of Israel and the Son of God. Then the next paragraph sets forth a challenge. Quote, another focus for Catholics must continue to be the highly complex theological question of how Christian belief in the universal salvific significance of Jesus Christ can be combined in a coherent way with the equally clear statement of faith in the never revoked covenant of God with Israel, end quote. So from the Vatican's perspective, it's directing us right for this sensitive and difficult discussion. This question is indeed complex, but it is also, should be recognized, not new. As is well known, Nostra Aetate affirmed that the Jewish people remain dear to God in section 4, and in section number 2, it then states, or previously states before section 4, it says, indeed, the church proclaims and evermost proclaim Christ, the way, the truth, and the life, end quote. Some understand the call to proclaim Christ in section 2 to undermine the positive affirmation of the Jewish people in section 4. G&C, or the document Gifts and Callings, we'll call it that for short, essentially asks Catholics whether claims about the saving significance of Christ and the election of Israel can be combined in a coherent way. I want to quickly sketch 4 possible answers to this question of trying to make those two claims cohere. The first possible answer might be referred to as dual covenant. This view holds that there are separate covenants, God's covenant with the Christian people and God's covenant with the Jewish people. But the document also makes clear there can not be 2 ways of salvation, since Christ is also the Redeemer of the Jews in addition to the Gentiles, end quote. A second answer that's possible is what I would call the rejection or avoidance of the election of Israel. This could be referred to as the idea of punitive supersessionism in Kendall Sulin's terms. The document Gifts and the Calling of God defines this as, quote, because Israel had not recognized Jesus, the promises and commitments of God would no longer apply. The document says this is unacceptable. It rejects punitive supersessionism. Although punitive supersessionism is now rejected, however, some Catholic theologians still hold to what is called an explicit or an implicit economic supersessionism, what I have called the view that Christ's fulfillment of the law renders Jewish religious practice obsolete. In addition, some hold to what they refer to as a soft supersessionist position, using David Novak's term. These seem to me to be economically supersessionist in disguise when the claim is that Christ fulfills Judaism, and yet it does so in such a way that causes these theologians to be silent on whether there is a positive theological value to Judaism at all after Christ. This position claims Christianity fulfills and goes beyond Judaism, but as I said, it avoids the question of whether God wills the existence of Jews and Judaism now. A third possible answer to the difficult question is what I refer to as redefining the election of Israel as Jewish Christian remnant. To overcome standard Christian claims that Christ fulfilled and made obsolete Jewish law, some Christian theologians have argued that Jewish converts to Christianity today must continue to observe Jewish religious practices within the church. These scholars understand the acid test of supersessionism, a phrase from Michael Wishograd, to be whether Jewish converts to Christianity are expected to leave their Judaism behind. Regarding the difficult question from above, the complex question, these scholars think that God's covenant with the Jewish people, the claim that that covenant continues, and the claim that Christ is the universal Savior of all people can only be reconciled in a coherent way if one redefines God's irrevocable covenant with the Jewish people as a covenant that continues with Jews who have become Christians. Gifts and Calling, the document from the Vatican, does not comment on this idea. But to say that God's covenant with the Jewish people continues only for Jews who convert to Christianity does not seem to me as a solution to supersessionism. It seems as if it's part of the problem. A fourth answer is the rejection of Christology. Some scholars affirm the election of Israel, but downplay or jettison fundamental elements of the church's Christology or the Christological interpretation of Scripture. For example, some would say fulfillment language leaves little room for the continued existence of Jews and Judaism. Others think that the idea of the Old Testament as preparation for the New reduces the First Testament to only a preparation for the Second, and then erases Jewish readers of the Hebrew Bible. According to GNC, though, confessing the universal mediation of Christ belongs to the core of Christian faith, and the document also affirms, although with important caveats, Christological readings of Scripture. In my view, all these proposals seem to be attempts to alleviate the tension between the Christian affirmation of Christ and the election of Israel by either rejecting or redefining the election of Israel or rejecting the church's Christology. GNC seems to point in another direction to the importance of confronting something very old, Paul's eschatological conception of mystery. It states, quote, that the Jews are participants in God's salvation is theologically unquestionable, but how that can be possible without confessing Christ explicitly is and remains an unfathomable divine mystery. It is therefore no accident that Paul's soteriological reflection in Romans 9 through 11 on the irrevocable redemption of Israel takes place against the background of the Christ mystery and culminates in a magnificent doxology in which Paul says, "Oh, the depths of the riches and the wisdom of knowledge of God, how inscrutable are his judgments and how unsearchable his ways." The authors then imply that this mystery is the basis of their explicit rejection of institutional missionary efforts. Quote, Christ is also the Redeemer of the Jews in addition to the Gentiles. Here we confront the mystery of God's work, which is not a matter of missionary efforts to convert Jews, but rather the expectation that the Lord will bring about the hour when we all will be united, when all peoples will call on God with one voice and serve him shoulder to shoulder. The citation of the last line is from Nostra Aetate and raises the question of how Romans 11:25 was interpreted by the drafters of the Declaration. As I discuss in the next little section of my talk, GNC's rejection of institutional missionary effort will make more sense in the context of how Romans 11:25 was interpreted by the drafters of the Council. At the Second Vatican Council, the ideas that emerged out of a Christian theological struggle against Nazi racial anti-Semitism. John Oesterreicher, Karl Thieme, among others, fought to prevent the synthesis of Catholicism with Nazism during the rise of the Third Reich. As these theologians worked, they confronted ancient ideas, ancient anti-Jewish ideas, and through a heated exchange with Martin Buber in 1948, Karl Thieme came to recognize what was needed to overcome this ancient Christian anti-Judaism, namely the Christian perception of Jews as a carnal and degenerate people. Thieme challenged this teaching by drawing upon Paul's words in the letter to the Romans that Jews remain dear to God despite their attitude toward Christ. In the affirmation that God holds the Jews most dear, as well as its deliberate use of phrases like offspring of Abraham to refer to the Jews as a people instead of only a religion, the drafters rejected the idea that the Jewish people were like a people. They rejected the idea that the Jewish people were a people like any other. Theologians and New Testament scholars within the halls of the council responded with appeals to Galatians and Hebrews, and they claimed that the Jews' role in history as the chosen people was obsolete. Some members of the Curia argued that a union of the Jewish people with the church is part of the Christian hope. and they cited directly to Romans 11:25. They asked that the statement likewise declare a hope that the Jews would enter the church. Ultimately, however, the drafters of Nostra Aetate would reject a focus on mission. And they did so on theological grounds, not for pragmatic reasons alone. Heschel's influence is often mentioned at this point and is very significant. But I think a vital point is that the drafters of Nostra Aetate recognized that the attempt to ground a mission to the Jewish people in Romans 11 would deeply distort Paul's letter. This argument about the distortion of Romans 11:25 was made by the Swiss Jewish philosopher Ernst Ludwig Ehrlich, among others. Ehrlich pointed out to Oesterreicher in a letter that the reading of Romans 11 was wrong. He wrote, quote, "Please do yourself and me a favor. Hurry to the secretariat and show the people there that the text is simply wrong and that a well-grounded New Testament reading must be found. Any notion of conversion is excluded entirely. I really cannot understand how they could claim to be making reference to Paul." End quote. Romans 11 does not mention the entry of the Jewish people into the church. Rather, Paul declares in verses 25 through 26 that the Christians he is addressing must not remain ignorant of a particular mystery, a mysterion, or they may become guilty of the vice of presumption concerning the Jewish people. Paul writes in verse 25, quote, "I do not want you to be unaware of this mystery, brothers and sisters, so that you will not become wise in your own estimation. A hardening has come upon Israel in part until the full number of the Gentiles come in, and thus all Israel will be saved." The drafters of Nostra Aetate then agreed that Romans 11 indicated that St. Paul expects the full number of the Gentiles to come in during the present age, but that Israel's salvation is an eschatological hope directed at the end of time. Oesterreicher concluded that Paul's vision was therefore eschatological and not focused on proselytism. He therefore suggested a line be inserted, which was borrowed by Karl Thieme, who had also advocated for this reading of Romans 11, verse 25. Thieme's line, which cited to the eschatological vision of Zephaniah chapter 3, verse 9, would actually be included in the final draft that the bishops would approve in 1965, that speaks of all people standing shoulder to shoulder at the end of time. Therefore, the Zephaniah line, which is very famous and well known, is a line that Thieme and Oesterreicher preferred, but it's important to recognize that it is inspired by a particular interpretation of Romans 11:25. And for this reason, we can say that a theological and biblical reason, the rediscovery of the mystery of Israel, motivated the Council Fathers to drop conversion. Instead of a theological focus on mission and Jewish converts to Catholicism, the architects of the Declaration heeded St. Paul's instruction to stand in awe of the mystery and leave the salvation to God. Elements of the recent Paul within Judaism School of Biblical Scholarship seem to confirm the views of Oesterreicher and Thieme, and thus reinforce Nostra Aetate's attitude of awe toward the mystery of Israel. Indeed, Mark Nanos has shown that a translation of verse 25 should be attended to. His translation is as follows, quote, "For I do not want you to be unperceptive, brothers and sisters, about this mystery, so that you would not be mindful only of yourselves, because for a while a callus has formed for the protection of the injured branches of Israel until the fullness of the nations shall commence." Nanos argues that the Greek term porosis, from poroo, traditionally translated as hardening, this term evokes the thought of Pharaoh's hard heart. But Paul does not use the Greek word for Pharaoh's heart. Indeed, poroo is actually a medical term referring to the formation of a callus to protect a wounded limb. A callus involves hardening that is not a negative attribute for a damaged limb, Nanos writes. Unlike the negative case of hardening of a heart, it is a positive one. A callus promotes a healing, a protecting of the injured area so that life can be conducted in and through it. thus serving the interests of the overall body so that it can be restored, saved, healed, rescued. In the era of grace, that's an end quote. In the era of grace, I think a protective callus has formed on Israel until the fullness of the nations commences, and then all Israel will be restored. St. Paul's aim in his famous olive tree analogy, which dominates the chapter and is at the center of 11, is to admonish Gentiles to adopt an attitude of awe. He says, do not become proud, but stand in awe at a particular mysterious eschatological reality. The Jewish people remain dear to God apart from Christian understanding about God's divine plan and the salvific significance of Christ. In other words, to be aware of the mystery means one is not ignorant of the fact that the Jewish people are beloved, despite Christian blindness concerning how and when of salvation. Nanos writes, quote, God is protecting these Israelites in spite of present appearances of their state from the viewpoint of the non-Jews addressed, end quote. To remain unaware of this mystery can cause Christians to establish a dichotomy between the Jewish people and Christ that is foreign to the vision of Romans 11 and seems to foreclose the eschatological tension in the era of grace. At the council, the drafters were faced with a question not unlike the question that gifts and the calling of God, the 2015 document, asks Catholics to study. They were faced with the question of how can the universality of salvation in Jesus Christ cohere with the election of the Jewish people. GNC rejects institutional mission and seems to suggest we follow the drafters of Nostra Aetate's reasons in doing so to confront the mystery of Romans 11. Let us now briefly turn quickly to the Catholic Church's affirmation of the spiritual life of Rabbinic Judaism, which I think comes through, especially in a number of the documents from the Commission for Religious Relations with the Jews. We can see this theme. In particular, in 1985, the Church affirmed that the Jewish people, under persecution of Christian Europe, gave the world a faithful and heroic example. Pope Francis in 2013 said that the Church looks upon the Jewish people and their faith as the sacred root of Christian identity, and that it is life-giving for the Church. And in 2015, the Commission for Religious Relations with the Jews affirmed the spiritual life of Rabbinic Judaism. In 2018, Pope Benedict XVI spelled out, Emeritus Benedict XVI spelled out the implications of these positive affirmations for Judaism for questions concerning mission. He said, quote, a mission to the Jews is not foreseen and is not necessary. A mission to the Jews was simply not foreseen and not necessary because they alone among all the peoples knew the unknown God. In my view, for Christians to engage in personal mission to Jews is bad timing. It is unfitting given Catholic rediscovery of the mystery of Israel. God has placed a callus upon this people whom he holds most dear. They are the people whom God desires to exist now. They illuminate the nations with the light of their law. And as the root of the good olive tree, they nourish the Church's faith in the Jewish human nature of Christ. Their salvation is in God's hands. On this point, Benedict is clearer than gifts and the calling of God. A mission to the Jews, he says, is not necessary. And as he said, mission is not necessary because the Jewish people alone, among all the peoples, know the unknown God already. And that the Jewish people possess the knowledge of God is also something Thomas Aquinas assumed. In an extended discussion of Israel's prerogatives, Aquinas applies Christ's words to the disciples from John, chapter 15, verse 15. That verse, you may recall, is where he says, I have called you friends to the disciples. But Thomas Aquinas applies this phrase directly to the Jews on account of their receiving the knowledge of God. Aquinas says, in quotes, the words of God were committed to them as to his friends. And then he quotes John, I have called you friends. In my view, to describe Jews as friends is significant for a few reasons. It directly reverses the egregious insertion of the term theos, God, into Romans 11:28 by some translators of the NRSV that makes it seem as if God as if St. Paul called Jews enemies of God. And second, it could also direct Christians in the opposite direction of anti-Semitic and anti-Jewish theological concepts, such as the election, and toward positive theological concepts, such as the election of God of Romans 11:28, and the gifts of God of Romans 9, verse 4. The concept of friendship can also orient Christians to act for the concrete good of the other, rather than only sentiments. At the end of my paper, I also suggest a few different ways that Christian theologians can carry forward the vision of this affirmation of Rabbinic Judaism that I think is really something caused by this recognition of the mystery of Israel at the Second Vatican Council, namely that Christian theologians can engage in the deep study of the Jewish tradition through comparative theological methods, becoming familiar with, for instance, Jewish thinkers from across the centuries. And secondly, Christian theologians can also benefit from this renewed and positive understanding of Judaism by engaging in perhaps what might be a dialogue with the Catholic teaching documents of the Commission for Religious Relations with the Jews, which offer many biblical principles for avoiding anti-Jewish interpretations. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Tapie, for your talk. And I'll remind you to please say your questions for the end of all three talks when we'll have an open general Q&A session. So moving on to our next speaker. Our next speaker is Dr. Michael G. Azar. He is Associate Professor of Theology and Religious Studies at the University of Scranton. He holds a PhD in New Testament from Fordham University and an MA in Theology from St. Vladimir's Orthodox Theological Seminary. His current research focuses on ancient and modern Jewish-Christian interaction, particularly in light of Orthodox Christian hermeneutics and the historic presence in the Holy Land. His other scholarly pursuits focus on New Testament studies, especially apocalyptic thought and the quote-unquote parting of the ways, as well as the effects that contemporary socio-political policies have on scholarly understandings of the ancient world. Dr. Azar's talk for us this afternoon is entitled Rethinking Jewish-Christian Relations and Orthodox Christian Theology. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Azar.
Thank you very much, and thank you to Jesper for inviting me to this conference. My purpose today is to consider broadly some elements of historic Orthodox Christian resources that I believe can positively impact the contemporary relationship between Jews and Christians. In pursuit of this purpose, I will first address the way that Orthodoxy itself has tended to view its own resources for thought and practice. Second, I will address and critique the ways that the historiography of Jewish-Christian relations has tended to characterize those sources. And third, I will offer some reflections on what Orthodox traditions can provide for Jewish-Christian interaction, should one approach them differently than the historiography of Jewish-Christian relations typically has. With these points, I hope to elucidate further avenues for Orthodox participation in Jewish-Christian dialogue that benefit Jewish-Christian rapprochement, but hopefully avoid unduly subjecting Orthodoxy to the norms and expectations of a primarily Western discourse. Orthodox resources for the spiritual life, by which we mean our holistic and ongoing formation toward the likeness of God, typically comprise what we label holy tradition. By this, we do not merely mean a body of teachings or doctrines or canons or directives, but the entire and wondrously amorphous experience of the people of God, in his spirit, through his word, forever incarnate in the law and the prophets, the apostolic writings, the fathers, the councils, the saints, the liturgy and its mysteries, typically called sacraments in the West, the art, contemporary bishops, and spiritual elders. This is one unbroken, continuous strand enabled and evidenced by God's indwelling within his people. The Orthodox Church has a central body of teachings, but no official universal catechism. What primarily matters is not what each authority, whether ancient saint or recent elder, says or does individually. What matters is that even as one ferociously bangs on a drum and the other gently plays a violin, Together, they contribute to the harmonious symphony of holy tradition, whose goal and character, as Father George Florovsky has famously said, is scripture rightly understood. Contrary to many descriptions otherwise, orthodoxy is not chiefly a unity of doctrine or even practice, but the unity of a people created and sustained by God's faithfulness. Yet, in the history of Jewish-Christian relations, starting in the early days, for example, with James Parks, the Christian tradition has not, to say the least, been well received. Though producing many positive results, of course, this historiography has nonetheless portrayed the Christian tradition, especially the Church Fathers, as more or less offering a monolithically contemptuous Christian doctrine. And here I have doctrine in quotes for reasons that will become clear. The doctrine of Jews with direct links to Nazi violence. If therefore I am to reflect on some of the benefits of a tradition as traditional as orthodoxy, I must first address the historiography that has so negatively characterized its sources, and more importantly, those who adhere to them. To do so, I turn to the British historian Quentin Skinner's 1969 essay, Meaning and Understanding in the History of Ideas, in which Skinner challenges the notion that a history of ideas, any history of ideas, can or even should be written, contending that such studies are inevitably plagued by a series of what he calls mythologies. Though his essay chiefly concerns political matters, many of his observations are worth considering in regards to the historiography of Christian-Jewish interaction. The first mythology to which Skinner points is the mythology of doctrines. By this, Skinner means the scholarly tendency to organize and elevate the scattered remarks of historical writers into a quote-unquote doctrine they themselves never claimed to hold, nor indeed could have. The major issue here is that it is not the author himself or herself that is closely considered, but the reified or hypostasized idea. Any comments in our case, to use an example, from an ancient writer that might challenge the constructed mold of the reified doctrine under investigation tend to be either ignored or reduced to exceptions, such as when even Origen, says that the Torah should be followed in its literal, not merely its spiritual dimensions. This tendency to investigate historical writers only under reified ideas, according to Skinner, is closely linked to a second mythology, the mythology of coherence, in which the historian seeks, quote, to supply historical texts with the coherence they may appear to lack, unquote. This mythology generally ignores the stated purposes or characteristics of an individual writer's particular composition, or overlooks the differences between a string of works under the temptation, Skinner says, to find a message which can be abstracted or more readily communicated. To use but one example, the Epistle of Barnabas and John Chrysostom's Adversus Judaeos are often spoken of in the same breath in Jewish Christian historiography, but there is little they share in common, and definitely not enough that they might both be perceived as elements of a coherent doctrine. The third and final mythology to which Skinner points concerns the very reasons why one might choose to study historical texts at all. And I quote, when considering what significance some particular text may be said to have for us, it is rather easy in the first place to describe the work and its alleged relevance in such a way that no place is left for the analysis of what its author may have intended or meant. The characteristic result of this confusion is a type of discussion that might be labeled the mythology of prolepsis, the type of mythology we are prone to generate when we are more interested in the retrospective significance of a given episode than in its meaning for the agent at the time. Few historiographies of Jewish-Christian relations, in our case, have been interested in something like the inner workings of St. Cyril of Alexandria's complicated and intertwined theology, as much as they have operated under the concern and assumption that his works led and lead to truly tragic consequences. While the reasons may be both honorable and necessary, such historiography nonetheless exhibits in Skinner's terms a somewhat naive view of historical causation. Far too many works make it appear as if the Nuremberg authorities combed through the thick marshes of Cyril's pre-Nestorian untranslated exegetical works in pursuit of ammunition against Jews. It is possible that they did, but unlikely, and if unlikely, then why is the rhetoric so prevalent? And what does this characterization say about Orthodox Christians, a tradition famous for its commitment to the Church Fathers? There is a real, even unintended ethical danger in so frequently drawing this link between the hallmarks of Orthodox tradition and Nazis, especially here in Jerusalem, where society is hardly immune to nationalism and racism, and the majority of Christians under Israel's military oversight and in surrounding lands are Orthodox Christians. One of Skinner's overall points is that the history of ideas research frequently, but entirely wrongly, characterizes ancient writers in terms that either A, did not exist, or B, whose meanings, and more importantly, functions, have changed so drastically in time and space that a link to later writers cannot be so easily construed. In other words, for historiographers to put Paul's or Barnabas's or Cyril's or 19th century German Protestants' comments about law or Israel under the same heading as a singularly traditional doctrine is to assume entirely wrongly that, as Skinner says, and I quote, there is any one set of questions to which the different thinkers are all addressing themselves. It is indeed possible to speak of historical causality, but it must be done with far more attention than the historiography has often offered. As an example, I turn to the ubiquitous assertion that Christians have forever and in all places understood themselves to be the new Israel. One of the most common features of the ostensibly traditional and monolithic Christian doctrine of Jews, according to numerous works of the last 100 years, is the idea that Christians have since the earliest days claimed to be the new Israel that superseded the old. Indeed, this was the original definition provided by Roy Eckhart when he coined the term supersessionism in 1972. However, to my knowledge, and here I focus on Greek Christian literature, the phrase Israel with the adjective kenos does not appear at all, though the same adjective regularly appears with covenant as in Jeremiah 31 or 2 Corinthians 3. Israel with neos appears, however, but only quite late in the Greek Christian period and not always with reference to the church, and I'll return to some examples in a moment. Rather, Greek Christian texts typically continue the Septuagintal practice of speaking of the assembly, church, of God's people as Israel, period. Accordingly, it seems possible to me that the tendency of Jewish Christian historiography to assert that Gentiles, quote unquote, broke from Jews and called themselves the new Israel, combined with the scholarly tendency to make patristic writers more Greek and philosophical and less Semitic and biblical than they themselves claim to be, prescribes far more than it describes. But I should be clear. Ancient Christian authorities often and quite negatively juxtapose such terms as Gentiles and Jews or Israel and church and law and gospel and so forth. But following Skinner's critique, one must not make the mistake, especially with so little awareness to the wider thought, context, vocabulary, and style of each writer, of assuming that a historic writer meant what writers elsewhere in time or space might have meant. Pauline scholars have often recognized that what Paul means by nomos or pistis and the apparent opposition between them is not necessarily the same as later writers. But when it comes to establishing the historic Christian doctrine against Jews, such historical precision has often been absent. One cannot assert, in other words, that a 14th century Gregory Palamas or a 5th century Cyril of Alexandria or even a 4th century John Chrysostom assumed that the rise of the church canceled out the law or Israel in entirely the same way and especially with the same function as a post-Enlightenment German Protestant thinker influenced by a Hegelian concept of time and progress. As Skinner says, and I suspect that those attuned to the Jewish context of the New Testament might agree, I quote, "The persistence of particular expressions tells us nothing reliable about the persistence of the questions that the expressions may have been used to answer." So how can one read those examples well after the first millennium of Greek Christian thought, where Israel does appear with nails? Here we'll turn to St. Gregory Palamas's sermon on Palm Sunday as an example, in which he speaks of the, quote, new Israel of the Gentiles who become sons of Abraham by grace. As many New Testament scholars would recognize, neos does not necessarily, if at all, carry the connotation of something new that replaces, let alone supersedes, something old. Rather, it bears the connotation of new in the sense of young or perhaps renewed. Thus, Philo, for example, speaks of Israel, by which he means Jacob, as the younger neoteron brother. In Greek Christian thought, to describe the Gentiles as ho neos Israel is not necessarily different from recognizing them as neoteron, the younger brother. This to me is an important point, especially since modern Jewish Christian literature has often turned to the metaphor of older and younger brothers as a means out of the ostensibly traditional doctrine of supersessionism. One of the few, though considerably late, occurrences of ho neos Israel as a complete phrase comes from the 11th century Michael Psellos, whose comments can serve as a valuable springboard toward considering a way of reading historic sources that acknowledges repeating patterns, but avoids the mythologies of doctrine, coherence, or prolepsis. Psellos does not use the phrase ho neos Israel to describe the church versus Israel, but of the latter itself after the exodus from Egypt. This Israel, I might add, is very much a new neos Israel, different from that which it was in Egypt. It has now been called out, kaleo ek, but that is not to say that it isn't the same Israel, or that those who chose not to follow Moses are not Israel at all. According to Genesis, the latter cannot be other than Israel. They descend from Abraham, but are they the same Israel? The true Israel, one might say, the fullness of Israel, the Israel that followed Moses out of Egypt in order to embody fully the Torah. Scholars have long recognized that Paul's letters in his vocabulary of law and gospel, old life and new life, slavery and freedom, cannot and should not be understood apart from the essential matrix afforded to him as a Jew by the Exodus narrative. Only in the context of the Exodus can one make sense of Paul's two seemingly disparate views of Christ's effect on humanity in somewhere like Romans 5-8, where he glories in the universal and definitive act that righteousness has extended to all, yet seemingly dissonantly prods his audience to be or become righteous. One dies with Christ in the baptism of the Red Sea, but one must still continually die thereafter. Eastern Christian writers centuries after Paul continued to look to the transition that occurs in the Red Sea or the baptismal waters in terms as idealistic as Paul's. Something has definitely changed even when it really hasn't. What came out of the waters of the Red Sea or baptism is indeed something new, but it also must become new. It is true, but it must become complete. And it is of little surprise that they so often use the adjective neos to describe the post-baptismal life. The newly baptized is the newly enlightened, the neophytos. He or she is both the same and yet not the same person. But even with the transformation of the Red Sea or baptismal waters, he or she is not definitively complete, but like Israel, only continuing the process of becoming a true person and child of God, the new self which is being renewed in knowledge according to the image of its creator, Colossians 3. Thus, in much of Orthodox theology, even those of us who are part of the church are, so to speak, merely in Sinai awaiting the promised land of our formation into the likeness of God, often called theosis. Eastern Christian thinkers have regularly been influenced by the Passover Exodus narrative, as was Paul, in both their understanding of what transpires at baptism and in their understanding of the history of Israel/church. But much of the historiography, especially one of the so-called supersession doctrine, often misses this Passover context of Christian thought and instead prescribes a Christian abandonment of Passover more than it describes one. Take, for example, the first lines of the entries for Easter and for Passover in the Dictionary of Jewish Christian Relations. For Easter, it says, Easter is the annual Christian festival which celebrates the resurrection of Jesus. For Passover, it says, a major Jewish festival. Passover features in Jewish Christian relations only insofar as Christians associate the timing and the imagery of the festival with the death of Jesus. These entries obscure two important points. First, Orthodoxy typically does not refer to the feast as Easter. Rather, those languages in which Orthodoxy has found a centuries-old home, such as Arabic, for example, use the same word to refer to both feasts. Eid al-Fusha in Arabic, for example, meaning quite simply Passover. Orthodox English speakers typically transliterate from the Greek and call it Pascha. Second, and more important, even a casual perusal of the Orthodox liturgical texts of Lent and Holy Week and Pascha and Pentecost would reveal that Orthodox liturgical life, while of course focusing on the resurrection of Jesus, sees the entire event in terms of the Exodus. It is in fact a commemoration of the Exodus from Egypt as much as it is a commemoration of Jesus' death and resurrection, insofar as one can, theologically and liturgically speaking, make such a distinction at all. This is not a triumph in the resurrection of Jesus that merely took place at the time of Passover and otherwise supersedes the erstwhile Exodus narrative itself. It is rather a way of reading and entering into Moses' narrative through our liturgical life, recognizing it as an ongoing story that orients our place in the world and before God. Such is perhaps a reason that Orthodoxy has typically envisioned a far less severe distinction between law and gospel than known elsewhere. But all of these points are entirely obscured in this important dictionary resource, which instead distances Christian Easter from Jewish Passover in a way well beyond the historical sources. While Orthodox Christianity has at times done much wrong toward outsiders in general and Jews specifically, we are, as we so frequently admit, the chief of all sinners. I believe much of the historiography of Jewish-Christian relations has tended to prescribe rather than describe, often indiscriminately squeezing Christian theology into certain paradigms, especially one in which something supersedes and something else is superseded. Such tendencies, in so doing, have missed valuable aspects of an Eastern Christian theology that is so deeply shaped by the Passover narrative and accordingly simultaneously holds to an already not yet notion of salvation and formation into God's likeness that leaves much hope for Jewish-Christian relations. Such historiography, moreover, fails to give due time and worth to the fact that we each, Orthodox Christian and Jew, are fundamentally shaped by and hold to often competing yet very similar Passover narratives that cannot be reduced into simple doctrines or a history of ideas extractable from our liturgical life and the very real, sometimes tragic, experiences of our people. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Azar, for that talk. Now, I'd like to welcome Dr. Adam Gregerman for a response. Dr. Gregerman is Associate Professor of Theology and Religious Studies and Associate Director of the Institute for Jewish Catholic Relations at St. Joseph's University in Philadelphia. He studies and teaches about the complex relationship between Judaism and Christianity, focusing on biblical interpretation and religious dialogue and polemics, especially about theologies of the land of Israel and supersessionism. He is the author of Building on the Ruins of the Temple, Apologetics and Polemics in Early Christianity and Rabbinic Judaism, and numerous articles on Jewish-Christian relations. He serves as book review editor of studies in Christian-Jewish relations, which is hosted at the Boston College Center. He is also a member of the Board of Governors of the International Jewish Committee for Interreligious Consultations, and he is academic advisor to the National Council of Synagogues. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Gregerman for his response.
Good afternoon, and thank you for the invitation to join a vital and lively discussion. As I've gotten to know both speakers over the years, I'll use their first names. Let me start by saying that these papers were engaging and challenging and marked by the thoughtfulness I would expect from these two scholars from whom I've already learned much in the past. Before I move on, I just want to issue two caveats. I'm going to make some generalizations. Actually, I say apologize, one caveat about two traditions. I'm going to make some generalizations as we go about the Catholic and the Orthodox traditions based on their papers. Right? I recognize the papers reflect an individual scholar's views, but I also sort of recognize they're intended to reflect general trends in those communities. I'll also note at the start that it's helpful to read the Catholic and the Orthodox papers together. That is one of the nice features of this conference, was to juxtapose different perspectives, and some things emerge with special clarity. And so as I go, I'm going to point out some areas of overlap and difference. I'm going to start with Matt's paper, and I have just an apology up front, which is that my comments may not always line up with the version presented, since I was working with a longer draft that contained a lot of really rich insights. And so if I bring in some of those ideas, I hope I present Matt's views in that draft accurately and clearly enough that they sort of stand on their own, and that we might return to some of those in the discussion as well. Let me start by observing how much Catholic thinking is shaped by contemporary church texts. I'll say more about Michael's choice of text by contrast in a little bit, but one of the foci, of course, of Matt's writing is the Catholic text in the last half century plus or so, which have been a remarkable resource for thinking about Jewish-Christian relations, path breaking in many ways. And these have enabled sustained reflection on Judaism and Jewish-Christian relations, of course, by Catholics, but also in dialogue with Jews and even among Protestants, because they admirably get to the heart of some really difficult issues. Now, the corollary to relying upon contemporary texts is that there's sort of implicitly not much in the tradition, the earlier tradition, that's especially helpful, right? This was evident even in Nostra Aetate, which had to go back to Paul, relies so heavily on Paul, who's the first Christian writer that we know of. Now, I want to note that Matt had made a minor qualification about this in the version I saw, which is important, which is, he says, and I'm going to quote here, scholarly analysis of pre-modern Catholic teaching on Judaism tends to overlook or dismiss positive pre-modern elements, which can make it seem as if every positive Catholic teaching on Judaism today constitutes a revolution. That is, this idea that there's a pre-modern sort of source of insights that may be relevant. Now, Matt mentions a couple of theologians. He mentions Augustine, he mentions Aquinas, and it's a welcome reminder that he issues, and frankly, I think it's a challenge to modern thinkers to look back at that tradition. I think it would be valuable to think rigorously, critically about what would constitute a positive element. And it raises a few questions for me that I want to mention now. Is it historically or theologically responsible to draw on a positive feature of a pre-modern theologian's ideas if much of else what they say is quite negative? That is, if statements here or there, we might say sort of positive about Judaism, where's the balance, and how do we use a text like that, right? How do we even characterize this sort of approach, right? I mean, are we, is the person who does that recovering a lost or overlooked tradition? Is it a partial reading? That is looking for positive statements in some way, risking a distortion of an overall message. And in doing that sort of recovery, do the standards differ if one is, say, writing history, or if one is constructing a forward-looking theology, right? Those are two different projects. And the interest in recovering ideas, I think, has sort of different implications depending on what one is doing it for. Now, this topic applies to Michael's paper as well, with his focus on earlier texts, and I'll discuss this shortly. Now, second, staying with Matt's paper, I want to suggest another area of possible exploration that Matt's paper raises. So, Matt shows clearly the profound changed views on Jews and Judaism in Catholic theology generally. And it's like every big topic in theology is in some way addressed by these changes, right? So topics like covenant and eschatology and Christology and salvation and mission and conversion, right? The discussion of Jews and Judaism in these Catholic texts, in many ways sort of have some influence all of these other topics, or related to all of these other big topics. And despite this awareness that it touches these topics, I simply don't know if to put it in the narrowest term, sort of an affirmation of an irrevocable Jewish covenant has challenged theologians in other fields. That is, I'm certain that everyone listening today is aware of the challenges of rethinking the Jewish-Catholic relationship, certainly in these Catholic documents. But I wonder if outsiders, that is, people who aren't specializing in this field, know this, apply this, right? I mean, if they don't, I wonder, so how do they ignore these ideas? And therefore, it seems like an essential step, sort of next step in Jewish-Christian relations might be to look carefully at the writings of Christian theologians who are not involved in Jewish-Christian relations, to ask, how are they affected by these issues? Are they affected at all? If so, how do they grapple with the challenges they raise? And if not, is it ignorance, or is it something deeper, right? Is it a resistance to engaging with some of these topics because they're fundamentally quite, they're to put it sort of euphemistically, they're challenging, potentially even threatening to certain sort of theological assumptions. The third topic I want to address in Matt's paper is the topic of mystery. And again, I'm going to quote Matt, who puts it this way, right? Mystery, it's a mystery how Christian belief in the universal salvific significance of Jesus Christ can be combined with the never revoked covenant of God with Israel, right? This idea that gets alluded to a number of times, right? The universal significance of Christ, the unrevoked covenant, characterized as a mystery. Now, this mystery concept is used repeatedly, and it's certainly used in recent Catholic documents like Gifts and Calling, and of course it's used in Romans 11 at the end of the chapter. And I want to dig deeper into this concept briefly, because it seems to me helpful to clarify the different meanings that mystery may have, right? Because on the one hand, it seems to me that a traditional use of mystery, and in this regard I'm going to be drawing on Catholic texts, a traditional use of mystery might be something that is inherently unfathomable, right? That we as humans can't understand. And I'll just quote two examples from Lumen Gentium, which from the Second Vatican Council, that Lumen Gentium has a couple of phrases that are characterized as mystery. So the topic of Christ going down from heaven into the womb of a human woman is called literally, the phrase they use is, quote, the divine mystery of salvation. Another example, so the dawning of the kingdom that Lumen Gentium discusses, right? A process that started but not yet complete. The phrase that's used here is, quote, the mystery of that kingdom. And I want to highlight sort of the nature of the mystery that the term is sort of being used for, right? These are topics, the kingdom, the descent of Christ, in Catholic theology, right? These are topics which one might at best have a partial understanding of, because I think the assumption here is because of human limitations, right? That humans by nature cannot perceive it all. And that's sort of one category of mystery, right? Matt sometimes uses it in that sense, a similar sense here, kind of an inherent sense of mystery. Now, what I think is important as a contrast is what an alternative use of mystery sort of reveals. That is, mystery being used also not about inherent limitations on what we can know as humans, sort of the first category I discussed, but rather mystery as an unresolvable tension on logical grounds. That is, there's a lack of full clarity or coherence between two claims, that there's a tension between two claims on logical grounds. So let me give you an example, right? The phrase again of, on the one hand, claims of the universal salvation in Christ, and at the same time, Israel's unrevoked covenant. But they seem to be this second kind of mystery. That is, neither statement alone is inexplicable or beyond understanding. But rather, when you put the two statements together, it becomes what's called a mystery. Again, quoting Gifts and Calling, referring to Matthew's paper as well. That is, claims for Israel's salvation turn into a mystery when simultaneously affirming Christian claims about soteriology. And the distinction seems to me to be important between types of mystery because it reveals the nature of the challenge that's identified by Matt and others. That is, a Catholic theology of Judaism is not mysterious because of inherent human limitations. That's the examples I gave earlier, right? If that was the case, there'd be limits as to how far Catholic theology could go. Rather, it's a mystery because of a commitment to two contrasting claims, in this case about Christ and about Israel. And that this calls forth, I think, a different type of theological response and perhaps even a different term than mystery. Okay, next I want to take a look at Michael's paper. So let me start by saying it's really a lovely description of the nature of the Orthodox tradition, the so-called holy tradition that Michael offers in the beginning, of a symphony of different instruments that, when brought together, produce this, sort of something greater than the sort of the whole is greater than the individual parts that all contribute to this holy tradition. And I think that's certainly helpful for, in this case, not non-Orthodox Christian. There's also helpfully a strong emphasis on Orthodox thinking and its engagement with past church fathers, right? In many ways, are shaped by that. It's, to contrast that to Matthew's focus on the contemporary Christian documents, right? Michael's sources are writers from the 4th century, the 5th century, the 11th century, the 14th century, right? There's not much from contemporary writers and not much from sort of contemporary setting. And I want to make that contrast because I want to perhaps raise for discussion why there appears to be very little written by contemporary Orthodox Christians on Jews and Judaism. And I would like to hear more from Michael about this, right? Is there little sense perhaps of a need to reevaluate church teachings? Are there limits to how much can be said in light of underlying Orthodox theology? I'd say, as a kind of corollary here as well, there's a question about the influence of historical events, right? So, of course, the Shoah looms large, and whether historical events prompt theological reevaluation. Now, because of this comparative reticence between the present, versus the Catholic tradition, which is sort of deeply engaged in it, I do think that there is great richness for this kind of nascent Jewish Orthodox Christian relationship to discover, to sort of deal with this tension between past and present. And I would just note parenthetically, it'd be really great to know what a Orthodox response might be to something like Gifts and Calling or Nostra Aetate, let alone to have some sort of parallel document. I next want to talk about Michael's presentation of contemporary scholarship. So Michael criticizes scholars for, and I'm going to quote here, often portraying the Christian tradition as more or less offering a monolithically contemptuous Christian doctrine of Jews with direct links to Nazi violence. And let me just sort of single out a couple of phrases here. The phrase being at the start here, monolithically contemptuous presentation of the history by scholars. Michael's right to note that the many theologians he mentioned, this is true really, all of them, that they have different reasons for writing. They have different contexts within which they write. Nonetheless, it seems to me that there is something of a monolithic approach to Judaism in nearly all of pre-modern Christian sources. I certainly can't claim to have read them all, but I do think that it's not unreasonable to identify prominent continuities in what Christians have said about Jews, right? You can go back to Justin Martyr in the 2nd century, and his theological critique of Judaism is in many ways sort of a template for what people say for centuries after. I mean, so, Justin has a hostility to Jewish readings of Scripture. Justin makes claims to the covenant that was originally with the Jews. Justin talks of Jewish sort of accusations of Jewish hostility to Jesus and then later to Christians. Just as a sort of sample of prominent ideas in Justin, I mean, these show up again and again and again for centuries. And while I don't really like the term monolithic because it has a sort of pejorative sense to it, I do think that there is undeniably continuities across time that it's fair to, I think, sort of focus on. I'll mention that I'm teaching a course on about the Sabbath, and when one looks at Christian critiques of Jewish practice, I mean, there's almost no change at all between Barnabas and Irenaeus in the 2nd and 3rd centuries and Calvin in the 16th century. Right? In many ways, the nature of the critique almost never changes, and that's just sort of one example. And so I'm going to sort of push back against the use of the term monolithic, because I think it characterizes negatively was actually, in fact, I think one of the distinctive features of Christian reflection on Jews and Judaism. I mean, I'll just mention briefly, Michael does talk about scholars making a direct link between Christian teaching and Nazism, and undeniably, obviously controversial and complex topic, and he's certainly right to advise against, sort of making these judgments. I mean, I would say, at least we're talking about scholarly work. I don't see this very often. I mean, I think people are aware that the stakes are very high and that accusations of direct linkage between, Chrysostom and Auschwitz are irresponsible, and so perhaps in more popular writing, that's something that occurs. It seems to me that one of the, and I think, admirable features of scholarship in this field by Jews and Christians alike is a recognition that one can't make those sorts of direct links. Can one talk about indirect links? Perhaps. But I don't think direct links show up much at all, perhaps with the exception of, a few sort of perhaps non-mainstream voices. Finally, I want to look at Michael's warnings against bad historiography. This is the methodological issue that he raises using the essay by Skinner. And he warns against bias and indifference to the diverse features of sources. Right? They have their own context, they have their own time and place. But the warning that he issues kind of buttresses his own sort of inclination, which is, and we see this a few times, sort of against viewing texts as anti-Jewish. That is, the possibility of this distortion leads to, it seems to me, a kind of, as I call it, sort of an inclination to, again and again, sort of make the argument that that claim of anti-Judaism is really not accurate. And what I'd argue is that the source really has to stand on its own. For example, I mean, an effort to demonstrate, to use Skinner's terms, right, coherence, or that something has conformity to doctrine, right, need not, one doesn't have to sort of lean one way or the other. I mean, let me give you, I'm going to give two examples where Michael does this, and I'm going to challenge that, right? Michael says that Origen speaks positively about the literal interpretation of the Bible, which does sound sort of favorable to Judaism on the face of it. And then Michael uses the example as an argument against the so-called myth of doctrine. Now, I think that's probably an unhelpful characterization of the use of origin in this way. That is, I think Origen's view of Judaism, put in most general terms, is very much up for debate. And the presence of a kind of favorable view towards literal interpretation doesn't seem to me to minimize his anti-Judaism. And that, if anything, that's manifest across many writers. It seems to me to be reflective of, if not a formal doctrine, certainly a prominent theme. And I'm therefore reluctant to say that we sort of can't make those judgments. I think we probably can, if done with care. Just a second example, Michael says, speaking about Barnabas and Chrysostom, quote, he says, there's little that they share in common. And in this case, again, Michael uses that as an argument to undermine the so-called myth of coherence. Now, again, I'm not sure that the idea of coherence or commonality across time is an inherently misleading one. That is, it seems to me that too is up for debate. That even if one should be cautious about drawing connections across time, there's no reason why one can't adopt a skeptical view about the possibility of this, right? So on a topic like Christian polemics, there is, I think, great continuity. And that while there may be differences between the two writers, there's also a whole lot that's, I think, unifies them and others. And that our sort of inclination ought not be to sort of be suspicious of coherence, but rather, again, like I said earlier, to sort of take the documents as they are and not sort of incline too much to see anti-Judaism or away from it, but rather to ask the question in this case of whether or not it's appropriate to find examples of, in this case, consistency. I therefore would want to have Michael's warnings in mind, but not apply them in a way sort of a priori that inclines us in either direction. If anything, I think they're probably best seen as kind of a heuristic for this type of study. And the historical claims need to be evaluated on their own merits. In closing, let me just say I very much appreciate the invitation to join you, the chance to wrestle with these difficult and important issues. And there's much that's raised for discussion. So I look forward to talking with Matt and Michael and others in the audience who raise questions. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Adam. And thank you again to all three of our speakers. Very grateful for the wisdom you shared with us this afternoon. As I said at the beginning of the session, I invite you to offer your questions in the chat feature or to raise your hand. As we wait for questions to come in from the group, maybe I'd like to give Matt and Michael an opportunity to respond to some of the topics that Adam has raised in his response.
Thank you, Andrew. Do you mind who goes first, or do you? Okay.
No, go for it. Go for it, Matt.
And how much time do I have in my response?
Maybe just a few minutes. I see Phil Cunningham already has his hand up, so maybe maybe you and Michael can briefly respond, and then we can turn it over and circle back around as the topic circulates.
Okay, it's an honor to respond to Adam, and I appreciate his thoughtful response so much. First thing that comes to mind on the task of constructing a theology versus the task of historical investigation of sources is that both are absolutely essential. We must do a historical investigation of sources. For me, that means that I must read Aquinas correctly, according to his context, and understand what context is driving his statements on Jews and Judaism. I think that ties in with some of what Michael was saying, some of the critique there. I think it's important to look back to the pre-modern tradition for resources. And this is another task, though. If you start looking for resources for a constructive theology of Judaism, a positive theology of Judaism, as we see in Gibson, The Calling of God, then you have a different sort of task happening. But Bernard of Clairvaux is cited in Gibson Calling as a resource, as a source of a positive theological vision. The fact that the task for Catholics is an enormous one is perhaps indicated by the fact that all of the citations from Nostra Aetate, when they had to go back to build a positive statement, are from Scripture. And so this is a new endeavor. There are certain areas of Aquinas where I have to be very clear in my writing and say Thomas holds this view this view no longer can be accepted based on Nostra Aetate's teachings as a Catholic. We have to reject this. And I've asked some Thomists, will you leave this teaching behind or that teaching behind? Because we can't hold to this teaching of Aquinas anymore after the Second Vatican Council. So there's an adjudication process going. And Cardinal Bea actually talks about this in his book, The Church and the Jewish People. Page 15, he actually addresses this. It was published just a year after the council, and he was wrestling with the same questions about what should we do with the church fathers. He says, take them case by case, essentially. So, in the sense of like analysis of their views. On the question of mystery, Adam, I have several thoughts, but really I'll just say it's significant to me. I think that the mystery is a rich concept for the Catholic tradition, and it's fertile ground for exploring more. There's just too much there as a topic to respond to. And you also had mentioned something about the affirmation of covenant, or how the affirmation of the irrevocable covenant touches Catholic theology. In my view, it sometimes does not touch systematics. And so part of, there's some, folks that are trying to work on that now, trying to make a more stable bridge between carrying some of the insights of Jewish-Christian relations over to Catholic systematic theology for a deeper conversation. But it's one that's, I think, it seems to me, very much in its initial stages.
Thank you so much, Matt. Michael, would you like to make a few remarks?
Yeah, I'll just be very brief, maybe just highlight three things. I think first, thank you, Adam, for your response. The comforting part of your critiques is you said what I thought you might say. That was very helpful. But as far as not talking about modern Orthodox writers, there are actually quite a lot. It's just, it is a subject of my research. It's just not what I focused on here. One particularly interesting book I could mention is a French scholar from the mid-20th century, Lev Gillet, wrote a book on communion in the Messiah that was sort of an Orthodox approach to Jews and Judaism, and published it in 1942. And so the fact that this book was often overlooked in historiography says more about what sources they were researching rather than what was available. And interestingly enough, it was recently republished by one of the Jews for Jesus organizations. So that's another interesting topic. And then there are plenty of others. The Nazi link thing, I think you and I might read different literature, because this is actually quite prevalent in the scholarly sources. In my paper, I cited a major comment by a major Johannine scholar on the Gospel of John and made the direct link. And it's quite an example. But even beyond that, my main contention here is the way these writers get character, because those that are more interested in Jewish-Christian dialogue are often not those that are specialists in these particular figures. So it's about the way that these characters get, or these people get characterized. And Cyril of Alexandria is an easy one, because he often only appears in Jewish Christian literature for his ostensibly kicking all the Jews out of Alexandria. And I emphasize ostensibly there because that's based on a dubious historical source of another problem. But never mind that he says things like, you can't blame all Jews for the crucifixion of Jesus, or you can't blame children for the sins of their fathers and things like this. He says it quite explicitly. Even contrary to the Gospel of John. He says that it was the fault of the Pharisees, not the Jews. He says it very specifically. So, these are interesting points that need not be dismissed or completely ignored, simply only to mention Cyril as the guy who kicked Jews out of Alexandria. Yeah, there are a few other things maybe it would lead to a longer discussion that because some that I'd like some clarification, but perhaps it's better if we move on to questions.
Thanks very much, Michael. I appreciate that. It's Phil Cunningham. I see your hand is up. Please join the conversation.
Hi, thanks very much. Let me thank both Michael and Matt for their papers. I'd like to have an hour conversation with both of them, but we won't do that right now. So in a limited time, let me address a comment to Matt, if I might. And what I'd like to observe, if I followed you correctly, that you mentioned 4 Catholic approaches to this question about relating the universal saving significance of Christ to Jews being in a presumably salvific covenant with God and the tensions that exist between them. Jesper and Mary Boyes and I were co-editors of a volume that deals with that very question. And so I'm drawing upon that to point out something. It's, again, I may not have caught everything quickly, but I think you mentioned 4 approaches. One was the dual covenant, 2 distinct Jewish and Christian covenants. Another was to minimize Israel's election one way or another. The third was to see Israel's election as being fulfilled in baptized Jews. And I guess the fourth one would be rejecting fundamental Christian doctrine or Christological, soteriological doctrine. It seems to me you've omitted one that I'm kind of fond of, which is, which I guess is a kind of single covenant theology, although I don't like to call it that because I don't think a covenant is an object, it's an intimate relationship. And so the approach of speaking about Jews and Christians as co-covenanting companions is another way of approaching this tension that was the heart of your really fine paper. This, as you know, understands Jews and Christians as both in covenant with the same God, walking down through history with that God, but doing so in different but yet resonating ways because it's the same Holy One with whom they're in an intimate relationship. I think Gibson Calling paragraph 24 taps into this without using that language when it speaks of the word of God is present in the Torah and that Jews encounter the saving power of God when they study the Torah. And of course, talks about Christ as the heart of the Christian encounter with God and so forth. So I just wondered if you'd comment on that. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Phil. I appreciate that. I was looking forward to this conference in part because I knew that sharing, this paper would allow for me to receive feedback just like this. And so, your comment is a reminder that I need to return to that volume and take a closer look at it. And the co-covenant companions, I think it sounds like it would fit in nicely to the typology.
Thank you, Matt. Matt, there's a question on the chat feature from Randall Zachman asking you to reflect a little bit on a verse a few after 11:25. You highlighted that in 11:28, Paul continues and remarks, as regards the gospel, they are enemies for your sake. And then in the same verse, but as regards elections, they are beloved for the sake of their forebears. So do you have any kind of comments on this broader context of 11:25?
Thank you. I think Romans 11 it can be somewhat of a minefield, really. If you look at the biblical commentaries, you have lots of options, and those options. This is part of why I didn't get to a whole lot of this detail, but I think considering, at least for Catholics, and when I talk with deacons and priests, I talk about Nostra Aetate as a biblical lens, as a way of reading scripture. And so, for instance, this would be a place where you would want to be careful and allow for the positive statements from Nostra Aetate to actually help you adjudicate which commentaries you select if you were a pastor. And so, for instance, characterizing, I think the Jews here as enemies is a mistranslation. I think it doesn't help us. I think there's other options. I've seen it translated regarding the gospel, they are presently estranged on our behalf, that they are separated, or that they are at a distance from the church. And so the conflict there, or the tension, is being expressed as a tension between Gentile believers in Christ and Jews who are not believers in Christ at that time. And so I think Paul's trying to express that tension. So I don't think it has to be translated that way. It's unfortunate.
Thank you, Matt. Bernadette Bruton, I see your hand up. Would you like to join our conversation, please?
Yes, thank you so much. This is a wonderful, the whole day today has just been fantastic, and I'm so grateful to all of the speakers. I have a two-part question. The first is to Adam Gregerman, And it doesn't relate to Catholic or Orthodox theology, but rather to the question of direct influence of Christian theology on National Socialists. And that is, we actually do have in at least Gerhard Kittel and Walter Grundmann direct influence, because of course they directly supported and were part of the National Socialism agenda. So that's important to keep in mind. And the other question concerns some of the differences between Catholicism and its major geographical locations, and Orthodoxy and its major geographical locations. And I can understand some of the differences between Dr. Azar's presentation in this context and Dr. Tapie's presentation, because, as Dr. Azar points out, National Socialists were not using Orthodox theology. They even in the regions occupied by the Nazis at their height, there were very few Orthodox Christians. Instead, as you point out, Orthodox Christians in the region of Jerusalem and surrounding areas are living in the occupied territories under Israeli military control, or in the state of Israel, which after the nation state law passed a few years ago, have legal disadvantages. So your situation is very different. Catholics, of course, may also live in that region and be a religious minority in that region. But Catholics certainly did have influence in the West. So I think that's part of some of the differences that we're dealing with. So do either of you any of the three of you want to comment on that question, those questions?
If I could comment on the history question. So, I mean, you're of course correct with someone like Kittel and others. What's, I don't say it's been more shocking, but the scholarship of John Connolly, which I think many of us are familiar with now, in demonstrating in the 20s, 30s, the complementary sort of anti-Jewish religiosity, there's this sort of theological opposition to Judaism, merging with aspects of secular racism, so that, I mean, it's in the most sort of blunt sense that baptism didn't work on Jews. I mean, if anything, we sort of have more direct links. That being said, and I mean, you're pointing to really kind of painful examples. I mean, for heaven's sake, we all still read, people read Kittel as a great scholar, and so it's very uncomfortable. You sort of realize these figures were involved. Now, the meta question, of course, is, so how do you draw the connections, right? I mean, is it, when you think about, for example, Christians in Nazi, roles, are they there as Christians, or are they there despite being Christian? And it's sort of, when you go to the level of ideas, it's sort of, how do any of these theological claims about Jews, hostile claims, how do those influence Nazi law? I mean, of course, this. And so it's at that point that it gets more difficult. With individual examples, there are, of course, very, very tragic ones. And in particular, we're learning more about this. But it's sort of even hard to use what criteria do you use to make these sorts of judgments. So thank you for mentioning it.
I guess I could add, the geographical experiences are definitely part of it. I mean, I neither want to overemphasize it nor underemphasize the geographical, the historical experiences. And I mean, really, what it comes down to, I guess, in terms of Catholic and Orthodox, is that the major centers of Catholicism have been, there's no good way to summarize this, but have been, sort of close to or part of the powers that be. Were Orthodox for much of the last couple of centuries, never mind previously was different, have been less so, whether under communism or Ottomans or whatever the case might be. But yeah, it definitely leads to major differences. But again, I don't want to overemphasize or underemphasize. Some of it is not just the character of the theology, but also maybe the way I read it as well.
Thank you, Michael. I think we have time. Oh, go ahead. Please, Dr. Bruton, go ahead.
I was just going to say we should look also at a Byzantine Catholic writes in the chat, and that's very useful. I don't mean certainly that they're not Catholics in the East. So I didn't mean that, but rather that Catholics are more prominent in the areas of the Nazis. That was my point. But this is very useful, what you've written here. Thank you. Yeah.
Thanks, Dr. Bruton. Oh, go ahead, Michael. Go ahead.
Just to add one of the major issues here for me is the relations between the Catholic and Orthodox churches are a major part of this. I mean, when Catholics are coming, half a century ago, coming around to their, to Vatican II and I guess newer ways of thinking in regard to Jews, was also about the time, but also in a way also separate, that Western theologians were less and less so disparaging of Eastern theology. And even while they were officially, abandoning missions to Jews, there were still Catholic missionaries to Orthodox lands. And especially in this part of the world, I mean, most of the Catholic churches, many of the Catholic and Protestant churches here in like the Palestinian territories are come from missionaries of the last couple centuries. And so this is kind of a sensitive topic for Orthodox, when it's, especially I think in Jewish-Christian relations, when, to give you the easiest example, in the Crusaders, our crusading period is brought up as a negative impact between Catholic or Christian-Jewish relations because Catholic crusaders were quite cruel to Jewish inhabitants. We're also quite cruel to Eastern Christians too, and I feel like that should be part of the discussion as well, at least not, not ignored as a separate topic.
Thank you, Michael. We're running short on time here. Dr. Svartvik has given us a couple extra minutes. He said his own closing remarks would be brief, so I don't know if there's any final question. Phil Yeviks, I've seen your comment in the chat. I don't know if there's a question that has generated from that reflection, if you would like to pose to the speakers.
And I apologize, I never got to a question because I just had been processing the very profound ideas that have been presented there. It seems to me the search for the proper context within which to understand our sources. And that one of the things that I've discovered is that in many of the negative statements in the Christian scriptures, in John Chrysostom, from Justin Martyr, they come from a time when the Jewish and Christian communities were actually neighbors, and there was a rivalry perhaps, but they were neighbors that spoke to each other. And it's in later historical contexts when there's no longer a living relationship between those communities that the negative comments can become toxic. And so it's just, again, that context as a way of understanding, and that also there is a sociological context for our own understandings. And so certainly the Shoah has forced us all to rethink the way we get along and the way we think about each other. And there are contemporary movements, and it was the earlier speakers mentioned the importance of religious diversity, or religious pluralism as a context that we all live within that's relatively new. So those are just kind of thinking aloud as we're going. I didn't want to take up any more time, but
Thanks very much. Adam, we have a couple more minutes. Why don't you wrap it up for us?
I just want, let me shut my hand down. I just wanted to express my appreciation that the last point Michael made, I think, is a really valuable one, which is, and he used the example of Cyril Alexandria, but let me sort of make it a kind of meta level question, which is, how do you read ancient sources, both in their time, but also with an awareness that, of course, there are later events, sometimes built on earlier sources that are, pulled out of their context, read in a sort of hostile way. Do you assign responsibility to those earlier sources? How do you balance different types of statements by an individual author, like Cyril? I mean, this is actually a really important question and not much addressed. That is, I think Michael's right that people do sometimes focus on one part of a writer, which is not itself problematic. That is, if you're aware that you're doing that, I mean, if you're focusing on something that someone wrote, that's a fair thing, as long as you don't say it's the only thing they wrote. But the question is sort of how do you balance that with a fuller reading of someone's, writings across time? I think it's a really good question. It's something that deserves more attention, because it's relevant for so many writers. It's not limited to a few, but of course you have a lot of writers who have very complicated views, and Origen is an example of that.
Thanks very much, Adam. With that, I'd like to thank again all of our three speakers for very insightful talks and for leading us through this concluding discussion. I think we all learned a great deal. And at this point, I'd like to turn it over to the present Corcoran chair and convener of this conference, Dr. Jesper Svartvik, to offer some concluding remarks. Dr. Svartvik.
Thank you very much. I only have a few minutes, so I'll almost skip the concluding remarks and just say thank you. But so much has been said in these rich and stimulating presentations, in the response and the discussion. Just one thing that Judy said almost in passing about the difference between the third and the fourth paragraphs in Nostra Aetate, that the third paragraph keeps saying we should forget. We have to turn a page, we have to go in another direction, whereas the fourth paragraph very much says we have to remember. So that reminds me of the uniqueness of the Jewish-Christian encounter, that because of scriptures, the heritage, etc., there is something here that we continuously need to explore. And I'm also reminded of the fact that this conference takes place during Lent, a time for soul searching, and I believe not only in terms of what we have said and done as Christians, but also what our denominations have said and done. And this conference is part of that endeavor. But it also takes place, at least today, either the weekend, either on the very day, the 25th, that Christians celebrate Annunciation, or today, this Sunday, like a foretaste of Christmas. So I hope that you too have perceived this conference that began today, both these aspects of the liturgical year. It's a matter of self-critical endeavor on the one hand, and on the other hand, a joy, a foretaste of something, as Christmas is for Christians. And I'm reminded of what Matthew Tapie said in his paper, I have called you friends, as I did in my opening remarks. So I'm very grateful for friends meeting like this and listening to and learning from each other. And I look forward to our next meeting next Sunday. Thank you very, very much to all of you.
Thank you, Dr. Svartvik. And as a concluding remark, I'd like to say that there's a room opening up, a discussion room at the conclusion right now, actually, if anyone wants to stay on and discuss today's sessions. So if anyone wants to come, please come in person. Oh, and then next Sunday, please email cjlearning@bc.edu.